So the first session is entitled Consolidation or Fragmentation of Executive Power, Brexit, Food Law and the UK's Search for a Post-EU Identity. The authors are Chloe Anthony and Emily Lydgate, both are UKTPO members. And just let me very briefly say, Emily is a reader in environmental law at the University of Sussex and Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. Among her many other activities, she's Specialist Advisor to the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, Standing Committee in the House of Commons. Chloe is an ESRC-funded doctoral researcher in environmental law in the law school here in Sussex. And she's also works with us in UKTPO on research projects. And she's an active member of the UK Environmental Law Association. So the session brings together essentially environment and trade in a way that is going to be very important, both technically and politically, as we move forward. Let me reiterate what Michael said. Please do have questions or comments, but please put them into the Q&A rather than into the chat. And I will do my very best to monitor them and try and make sure we get them answered. So you didn't come here to hear from me, so I'm going to pass straight over to Emily and Chloe, and I think Chloe is going to start this session off. So over to you, Chloe.
Great, thank you. So are these slides showing? Hopefully they're looking good. Just let me know if they're not. Thank you, Alan. And Emily and I are very pleased to be presenting today on Brexit and food law, and we are very much looking forward to your comments and questions. So in this presentation, we examine food law in post-Brexit regulatory mechanisms. These are the domestic mechanisms of retained EU law, the Common Frameworks Programme and the Internal Market Act of 2020. And we consider the implications of these new domestic arrangements for trade agreements. We focus on GB trade and don't examine the Northern Ireland Protocol due to constraints of time, but the protocol certainly acts as another regulatory framework that makes UK food law more complex and contentious. So why is this important? Post-Brexit regulatory frameworks allow for a streamlined reform of food law in response to trade negotiations. But this has resulted in less influence for the UK Parliament and devolved nations. Of course, the main aim of Brexit was to take back control from the EU. Any government should be able to change its laws, but the question is how? How may a government change its laws? How does a government allow for devolved lawmaking? And what are the implications for trade, particularly in relation to the management of divergence in regulations between the four nations? So turning first to the domestic mechanisms, I'll talk about retained EU law and common frameworks, and Emily will discuss the Internal Market Act and move to trade issues. First, to understand the post-Brexit legal landscape, an understanding of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 is required. This act at once removed the effective EU law in the UK and puts EU law onto the UK statute book. This is known as retained EU law. Retained EU law is incorporated into UK law by means of secondary and not primary legislation. Secondary legislation also known as delegated legislation, is made via statutory instrument. It's made by ministers, not Parliament. It's often not debated in Parliament. If it is, it's limited to 90 minutes, and it's not amendable by Parliament. This process contrasts starkly with the legislative processes for primary legislation in the UK and for these policy areas in EU law. EU food law is made via EU regulations. These are applied across the EU to all member states, ensuring common standards. And EU delegated legislation is subject to detailed procedural rules. Considerable concern has been voiced about the unprecedented use of delegated powers in retaining EU law and in new primary legislation going forward. This is against a backdrop of a long-standing critique of secondary legislation procedures in the UK. And in this context, the UK government gave assurances that no major policy change and no new legal frameworks would be introduced via delegated legislation under the Withdrawal Act. So how does this play out in the case of food law? We assessed how EU law has been retained by looking at the changes to the EU's general framework for food law, the General Food Law, and for key policy areas. So for product rules, we looked at pesticide maximum residue levels, for process rules, food hygiene, and for presentation rules, labelling. Taking the retained General Food Law as an example, although the EU exit secondary legislation retains the aims and scope of EU food law, the general principles of risk analysis and precaution, and obligations for businesses, there are important omissions. The General Food Law chapters on obligations for public authorities, on risk assessment, on the European Food Standards Agency and the Rapid Alert System, including how scientific opinions are taken into account and communicated, are simply omitted in the secondary legislation. Detailed provision for the delegation of powers is replaced by powers for GB ministers to make secondary legislation. The designation and role of the food standards agencies is not set out in the secondary legislation, only in the explanatory memorandum. Now, the UK food safety authorities undertake a similar but not equivalent role to the European Food Standards Agency. So arguably, this new regulatory regime should be set out in new primary legislation. And fundamentally, precaution in risk assessment is a controversial issue in trade negotiations. While this principle is retained in the secondary legislation, it is risk assessment procedures that are crucial in underpinning precaution. How risk assessment takes place going forward is not set out in retained EU law. So we found some cross-cutting governance issues arising in these policy areas. These were the simple omission of certain key elements of the EU regime without replacement or reference to UK arrangements, a consolidation of power to government ministers, enabling them to make changes to certain elements of the regulatory regime via secondary legislation and without adequate scrutiny. And because food policy is a devolved matter, power has been consolidated to ministers in the devolved nations, giving rise to the potential for divergent regulation without mechanisms for harmonisation. So while the problematic use of delegated legislation continues, two distinct approaches have been developed to deal with the problem of regulatory divergence. We have a cooperative approach of the Common Frameworks Programme and a legislative approach of the Internal Market Act. So first, Common Frameworks. In 2017, the Joint Ministerial Committee, the main mechanism for intergovernmental cooperation in the UK, agreed to develop UK-wide common frameworks for retained EU law. And Northern Ireland endorsed this process in 2020. Initially, 154 policy areas were identified for common frameworks. It's since been agreed that many don't require further action, and now 32 areas are being worked on. The Food and Feed Safety and Hygiene Common Framework deals with risk assessment and is currently in consultation phase. It was designed to plug the gaps arising in retained EU law. The aim is for food law and policy to be as unified as possible while allowing for evidence-based divergence. The draft framework sets out new arrangements for the risk assessment process, but it is set in the context of historically informal and ad hoc arrangements, long subject to calls for reform and currently undergoing review. The draft framework states that this will be a non-legislative framework, and the responsible minister recently described common frameworks as ways of working documents, putting their status further in question. So I'll now hand over to Emily to talk about the UK's legislative approach to dealing with potential divergence arising from retained EU law. This is the Internal Market Act, and then to discuss the implications of these three domestic regimes for UK trade policy.
Thanks, Chloe. So as Chloe said, common frameworks provided a cooperative process to ensure that we have some consistency of regulation across Great Britain, while still allowing room for divergence, but many of them are still unfinished. Those that are, like the Food and Feed Safety and Hygiene framework that Chloe discussed, still have some gaps in them. And the UK government was clearly getting increasingly nervous about this as Brexit Day approached. And in a sense, there's a very similar tension as with retained EU law, where the UK government felt it needed to act urgently in order to prevent a negative consequence. In this case, the negative consequences, potential trade barriers and legal uncertainty between Scotland, Wales, and England. And it responded by centralizing legislative authority and introducing reforms that are really far-reaching, so reshaping the UK's constitutional settlement. And these reforms took the form of the Internal Market Act, which creates a legislative basis for frictionless trade in Great Britain. It doesn't apply to goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland because that is governed by the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the Internal Market Act has really the same aim as common frameworks of replacing EU internal market arrangements, but it does so completely differently than common frameworks or than the EU internal market through the use of so-called market access principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination. So a key difference from EU law is that rather than harmonizing product standards, so in all the food law areas we looked at, product standards are harmonized at the EU level. The main way that trade between England, Scotland, and Wales is managed is through mutual recognition. And I'm going to skip over non-discrimination in the interest of time. So mutual recognition is part of the EU internal market, but it plays a much smaller role. In the Internal Market Act, it really forms the primary basis for trade in Great Britain. And what it does is to ensure that goods that are made in or imported into one part of the UK where they can lawfully be sold can also be lawfully sold in other parts of the UK. And regulations about goods that apply in that nation will be disapplied. Mutual recognition has a broad scope, so it covers physical characteristics of products, but also how they are made, certified, and labeled. There are some exclusions from having to recognize another UK nation's regulation or GB nation's regulation, but they're quite narrow. And really focus on sort of protection of health and safety. So this is more limited than EU law, which includes things like environment and public morals. There's also an exclusion pursuant to common frameworks, which I'll return to. So I thought I'd just briefly talk through two examples of hypothetical future scenarios where England decides to change its food law and Scotland wants to maintain alignment with the EU. And we chose this scenario because Scotland has set out its intention to maintain alignment with EU regulations, including potentially in the area of food law in the Scottish Continuity Act. So this is hypothetical example one. England approves a greater maximum residue level of malathion in apples, which conforms with international standards. But Scotland decides to maintain its existing EU-derived maximum residue level. So Scotland is welcome to apply or impose this maximum residue level domestically. It could even ban the use of malathion altogether, but it wouldn't be able to prevent apples with residues illegal in Scotland from being imported from England or Wales. And again, this is different from the EU, where maximum residue levels are harmonized among all member states. So let's look at another hypothetical example where England decides to allow pork to be treated with ractopamine, which is kind of a growth promoter, and decides not to require that it be labeled as such. So let's say that Scotland wanted to maintain a domestic ban, but then agreed, okay, you can export that pork from England to Scotland, but we want it to be labeled. Scotland would not be able to require a label on pork exported from England because the Internal Market Act requires that Scotland disapply its domestic requirements. And that includes for labeling. So, and mutual recognition also applies to imported products. So I put Australia on the right there. So if England changed its law, then Australia could export this product, because they do allow ractopamine, to England and then to Scotland. So obviously there are concerns here that the UK nation which produces the most and the most cheaply will de facto determine what regulations prevail in Great Britain. And as England has almost 85% of the population of the UK, obviously there's an asymmetry there. And if we add in imported products, it magnifies these concerns about competitive undercutting of high standards within the UK. Devolved administrations did not consent. And as it's a protected enactment, they're unable to appeal or modify the act. The bill initially made no mention of common frameworks, but it was amended to say that common frameworks can be listed as exclusions, but devolved nations still don't see this as sort of satisfactory, because the idea that common frameworks are exclusions rather than the primary way we govern the internal market is not what they had in mind. And also only the UK Secretary of State amends the schedule. So that's a very brief tour of internal GB food law and trade, internal trade. But what about external trade? So in my hypothetical example, ractopamine treated pork was exported from Australia to Scotland pursuant to the Internal Market Act, even though banned within Scotland. So a logical next question would be, how do devolved administrations work with the central government on FTA negotiations to ensure that food law in devolved areas is respected? And here again, the role of devolved administrations in trade negotiations is also governed by cooperative, what you might describe as soft law approaches, which are really based fundamentally on goodwill and information sharing. So devolved administrations don't have anything approaching sort of a veto over changes to food law that the UK might want to make pursuant to an FTA. And the fact that our food law now takes the form of retained EU law is also relevant here, because under the UK system of treaty negotiation, which is outlined under the Cragg Act and the Trade Act, Part 1, retained EU law can be modified by secondary legislation in order to implement FTAs. So in other words, there's no need for Parliament to pass primary legislation that would be subject to debate and amendment to implement FTA responsive changes to UK food law. So we've covered quite a lot of territory. Where does all of this leave us? So some have commented that the UK government hasn't actually made radical changes to its regulation post-EU exit. So we haven't seen the bonfire of Brussels red tape that some were expecting. And it's absolutely true in the area of food law that not that many substantive changes to UK food standards have happened. So, for example, we still have the same maximum residue levels that we had when we were an EU member state for pesticides. But the UK government has actually taken pretty profound reforms if you look across these regulatory areas. And what they do is to allow it to make future substantive changes to UK or future changes to UK standards fairly easily at the level of central government by consolidating authority through retained EU law, through the Internal Market Act and through international trade negotiations. But interestingly, even though we have this strong centralizing trend, there's also a countervailing trend towards more fragmentation in food law. So we have 2 of the 4 UK nations essentially maintaining alignment with EU regulation, Northern Ireland pursuant to the Northern Ireland Protocol and Scotland pursuant to the Continuity Act. So it's not difficult to propose legal reforms that would result in a more participatory and less centralized or contentious food law regulatory process. So, for example, we could introduce more primary legislation for food law, which would give it more transparency and more debate. We could exempt common frameworks from the Internal Market Act and introduce more exclusions to the mutual recognition principle. We could give devolved nations a stronger and more formal role in FTA negotiations. And this would, in a sense, move us away from these kind of soft law cooperative arrangements and toward harder law procedures, and in so doing, increase checks and balances and transparency. But because of the starkly different positions of devolved nations, and particularly Scotland and England, such reforms would also affect what Brexit will look like. And this could, for example, result in a more fragmented internal market, and there's plenty of models for that, for example, the United States, and also likely more willingness or more appetite for formal alignment with EU food law. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Emily. It's a pretty full menu, really. So we have a discussant, and so let me very briefly introduce her. It's Viviane Gravey, who's a lecturer in politics and international relations at Queen's University, Belfast, and she's co-chair of Brexit and Environment, which is an academic network investigating how Brexit is affecting EU and UK environmental policy. So over to you, Viviane, for an alternative view.
Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you, Chloe and Anthony, Chloe and Emily, for the really interesting presentation. You've managed to cover a huge amount in a few minutes. And of course, as a discussant, I'm going to suggest you cover a bit more. So again, take all the comments with disciplinary grain of salt as well. Of course, you're both legal academics. I'm a political scientist. So even though we are studying similar issues, we'll be looking at it from a different angle. So just to start with, I think I'm still struggling a bit to see a really clear red line throughout, because you are covering so much material. So I'm thinking perhaps here, more could be done at the beginning to discuss perhaps the nature of divergence, the nature of taking back control. Yeah, you can really see the political scientist in me speaking up. On divergence, I think there's a lot to be said, and you're touching on it already, about the difference between perhaps more performative forms of divergence, the type of divergence that was kind of talked about in terms of, just showing that we're different from the EU, and the type of divergence that you are actually finding here, which is a lot more around kind of technocratic divergence or more focused on governance, and where actually the taking back control is not just vis-a-vis the EU, but is really vis-a-vis the devolved administrations as well. So here I'd like to see a bit more, perhaps, I think it's really good that you took a step back at the end and try to discuss what this means for future trade relations, but I think you actually have a really good avenue here to talk a bit more about what this means for the UK constitutional settlement, and what do you mean, and I want to hear a bit more from you about what you actually mean about what the changes you're seeing for the UK constitutional arrangements. From a very practical perspective, I don't know where, of course, we never know where papers are going to end up, but I think there would be scope for a bit more definitions. Governance gap in the paper, perhaps less in the presentation, is a key concept that I don't think is actually defined much. It's one of these things that everyone talks about governance gaps, but we need to be sure that we are actually talking about the same thing. Similarly, consolidation is something that you mentioned a lot, but I would like to see a nice, simple, clear definition of it. I think you're doing a really great job by using the product process presentation kind of triad to explain what's happening in the different cases, but I think you can do more of it, especially for readers of this who would not be familiar with this, with food law in general. I think it would really benefit from having a table with just a definition of what each of these are and some examples. Just like very kind of practical illustrations, just to make it a bit more tangible for the reader. One big question I had looking in was, based on my own work, I would expect in the end that it would be ministers, but especially English ministers, to win in the end, that taking back control, kind of attention and power. But actually, at first, when you're talking about retained EU law, you're saying, it's actually all ministers in GB, and then you're showing how that apparent win for devolved administrations, even if it was a loss for devolved legislature, is then kind of rolled back through, mostly through the Internal Markets Act, but also even in a bit on the Common Framework ones. So I think it would be really nice to see as well there that in any case, what we've seen is from the very beginning, Brexit was about, that kind of centralization of power within the executive, but that there was what part of the UK executive, central or devolved, was actually going to benefit from it kind of changed a bit over time. So this is something that I think, that's what I understood, at least, that you're showing, but I think could be made clearer. And that's where also I want to see a bit more, and I think that was really good in the presentation when you talked a bit more about the precautionary principle. I think it'd be really good to talk about how, we've have reports like the Tiger report, for example, have been published calling for innovation principle instead. So these are not, of course, you're using hypothetical examples, but I think there's very, very clear risk. And these fights are coming between Scotland and I think Wales would be with Scotland on this one, definitely against England and the UK government and these kind of principles. In general, I think because you have so much data and it can get quite hard to follow, I would strongly suggest you put a bit more graphs, infographics, or even tables where we can see, the type of changes that have been done, especially to the SIs. I think there, and that's something I'd like to invite you to do a bit more as well, is to look at the work that has been done on the Brexit SIs by other people in other sectors. So, for example, two of my Brexit and environment colleagues, Brendan Moore and Lady Jordan, looked at the environmental SIs, and they found quite similar, slimming down of the governance arrangements part of it. So then, I think if you have, so we've got some evidence on environment, we've got now some evidence on food. Is it enough to perhaps push you a bit further and saying, okay, this centralization, this stripping down of transparency requirements, and of also keeping up to date with scientific development, and requiring, making it a requirement to consult with regulatory agencies before you change rules? Is this, can we say this is starting to be kind of a general trend of this kind of Brexit decision making? So that's something, again, that'd be really good. And also, finally, as I'm based in Northern Ireland, of course, I think it's perfectly fair, considering how much you cover, that you cannot cover the Northern Ireland Protocol in detail. I think you could stress a bit more when you say there's going to be tensions, between Scotland and England, that of course these tensions would also be with Northern Ireland as well, because Northern Ireland will have to follow EU food law unless there's massive change to the protocol, and that wouldn't be even the case by political choice, at least until we have a vote in the Assembly in 2024. So here, I think, just mentioning that when you have, it's not necessarily an England versus Scotland story, it might very much be, a London versus a devolved story in terms of regulatory divergence. And that's all for me. And thank you again for a really interesting paper.
Thank you very much indeed, Viviane. Emily, Chloe, do you want to make an extremely brief response, or just save up till later?
Thank you, Viviane. That was really useful. I just thought I might say something about the governance gap and consolidation, and we really struggled to try to fit all this in. I do think, as you suggested, that consolidation works in different ways in these different frameworks. So, for example, as you say, in retained EU law, executive authority is consolidated to ministers across GB, but then when it comes to the Internal Market Act, the consolidation works slightly differently, and it's very much a consolidation of based on market flows. So and sort of English market dominance, and also legislative asymmetry coming from the fact that almost all the MPs are in England, and then with the trade negotiations, again, we're looking more at the centralized authority of the UK government as having, as trade negotiations not being a devolved power. So I think it's a common thread, but it works differently in each context.
Thanks very much, Emily.
Tiny
bit.
Very short. Yeah, thank you very much, Viviane. And just to talk about the nature of divergence, yeah, I think it's very helpful, your comments. And I know you've done work on de-Europeanization. So yeah, it would be good to draw out perhaps more clearly and find out, some kind of metrics or way of analysing the nature of this divergence. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I've got 3 questions, in fact, on the Q&A at the moment, and not a huge amount of time, but if other people have questions, please drop them in. Let me deal with the first one. Does the principle of Internal Market Act not give rise to a risk of WTO challenge if Scotland differentiates imports from the UK, or I guess that means England really, from imports from the rest of the world? So I don't know if either of you wants to mention that, how it ties in with WTO law.
Sure. I mean, I think in some sense it works almost in the opposite direction, because what it says is that England could import a product that's legal in England, and then that product, pursuant to the mutual recognition principle, if exported onto Scotland, is also legal there. So I don't see how, pursuant to these market access principles, Scotland would be able to have a different external trade regime from the rest of from England, for example, because precisely what it does is to nullify those differences.
Okay, thanks. I've got another question. In a sense, it's almost the obverse from Alan Matthews. How might regulatory divergence within Great Britain affect how the EU would treat imports from the UK? For example, if England permits ractopamine treated pork, but Scotland does not, does that mean that Scottish pork pies, which might have sort of somehow drifted into England in the meantime, would be excluded from the EU? I suppose it amounts to saying, is the EU up to distinguishing between Scotland and England when it comes to the places where there are divergences?
I'm happy to jump in on that, but I don't want to dominate the airwaves.
Dominate away, Emily.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's a really excellent question, and I don't actually know the answer, but I would say that we are already, even though Scotland has this legislative intent to align with EU law, they're still going to be subject to all of the same regulatory and compliance checks that they would be as a third country, pursuant to arrangements with the UK as a whole, and in that sense, alignment with the EU isn't really getting them very much. It's positioning them for a potential rejoining of the EU, but it all of those same third country checks will still apply regardless.
So essentially, you're saying that it really undermines a lot. What Scotland can do is regulate production by Scottish producers for Scottish consumers. But it actually can't influence exports very much. It can't influence imports into Scotland from England.
I think that's right, but I think there's also is a question there that I don't know the answer to, which is if England does something which in the EU is banned and Scotland doesn't do it, how the EU will respond to that on in terms of its import arrangements.
Viviane, Chloe, do you want to add to that?
I think just to add, I think Emily's completely right on this. For now, I don't know of a case where the EU is willing to differentiate because different regions have different rules within the same country they're trading with. The EU has, developed quite, has been quite flexible on Northern Ireland. For now, they've not decided to have that same flexibility with Scotland. So a lot of this appears to be that Scotland would be kind of end up having higher regulatory standards and higher costs, but not necessarily reap the benefits of being able to have freer trade with the EU than England would.
Okay, thanks. A broader question now from Chris Horseman, but in round about the same sort of issue. Chris is dreaming if a future UK government wanted to realign with the EU via the single market, say the EEA, how formidable would be the obstacles, given that we are busily constructing a governance system that doesn't accord with that? Anyone? Go on.
So, I mean, I think that it's interesting to me to ask the question of whether there's a legal obstacle in the form of the Internal Market Act. Which allows for, and it's very relevant to the question that Alan raised, if we have all this divergence happening between UK nations, how is that going to square with overall harmonization of standards in a way that complies with EU requirements, which is what an EEA-style arrangement would be. And I think there's a fundamental incompatibility there. So I think what EEA-style alignment would do is reintroduce that element of UK-wide harmonization and would be a very different approach.
I'm going to abuse my position as chair. I have to say, my view is that quite a lot of government policy is designed to make it more difficult to slip back into alignment. And while it's not clearly the principal purpose of the things you're discussing, it's clearly not a constraint on government action, keeping that option straightforward. Okay, excellent. I've got another question, or I've got two questions actually, but I'll take them one at a time, from Michelle Egan. In terms of asking devolved regions for input into trade negotiations, the informality is common in federal systems like Canada, even the US, but they don't have veto powers. So what models are you going to suggest? What's your prescription for getting around this particular issue? And open to anyone who in 30 seconds wants to solve the big dilemma.
Yeah, I was just going to say impossible to solve and also a democratic matter. But certainly we can say that we have very underdeveloped intergovernmental mechanisms that do need reform and are currently being reformed. Yeah.
And I think just on trade, I mean, I think it's both a question of more power for the Parliament, which does represent all four parts of the UK, which has very limited power in trade. And then, I mean, we do have federal systems, like think of Belgium, where you do have vetoes of course, we all remember the Walloon Parliament vetoing EU trade deals. So it is possible. We can look at other federal systems beyond Canada and the US, would suggest.
Emily, anything to add?
I'll defer to my co-panelists on this.
Okay. It seems partly a matter of trust and tradition, and somehow we've a little bit got off on the wrong foot, I suspect, on that.
Well, it seems like we have the tradition without the trust, which is not a good place to be in.
Yes. Okay, so Michelle has got another question, a bit different. You mentioned mutual recognition and harmonization as models, but are they complementary in the sense that the EU uses them, that it tends to seek harmonisation at some minimum, and then possibly mutual recognition beyond that. One of the implications is, do we expect, or do you expect, market impact and size of England to push Scotland into regulatory adjustment, just because it's not worthwhile firms producing, as it were, to one set of rules if they're not going to be able to get into England as a result. That clearly depends a little bit on who is tighter and who is more relaxed. And your examples were both of Scotland being tighter than England, but it's not inconceivable it will be the other way around.
So, I mean, I absolutely see mutual recognition and harmonization as complementary constituents of an internal market. But I think that the issue we have in the UK is that we don't really have harmonization at all, except through these common frameworks. In their legal status is unclear. So that's why, and exactly as you said, that was one of the concerns that we and others have highlighted, is that when you don't have harmonization, then regulation becomes competitive between devolved nations, and you can have things like forum shopping, where producers go to wherever it's cheapest to produce, with competitive impacts. And I think, Viviane, you wrote a really interesting, useful piece on this about negative and positive harmonization and how they've been sort of reversed in this framework.
Viviane, that seems to throw the ball to you. So.
I haven't read that piece for a long time, so I don't remember the argument I made. But I think, I mean, in general, we do have here. No, I'm not actually going to. I think it would take too long to answer. I think let's just cut it short. I think I agree with Emily, basically. Okay,
so we have actually run out of time now, and I am asked to remind you about the Wonder facility, which I'm not sure if we're opening it now, Michael, that will say, or after the longer session. But it is the opportunity to engage Viviane, or indeed either Chloe or Emily, in more detailed discussions. We've got a 5-minute comfort break now, a longer break after the next paper, but Michael's popped up, and so I guess he is going to tell you about Wonder now.